Hello everyone, in today's video I'm going to be going over how I made a key feature in my Submarine Pirate Game in Roblox called Submerged Scoundrels, and that is having a fully working interior inside of my submarine. Now when I first started this game I fully intended to have a working interior. However, once I got to development those plans changed because of how I made the water. I'm making the water using the terrain editor inside of Roblox, which is great because it's really easy, really simple to use, and gives me full functionality for the water, including allowing the player to swim. However, the terrain clips through models, and as you can see down here, if I can go down my submarine, you can see that there is water inside of it, and that even though there's parts and a full exterior hull, there's still water inside of the submarine. And if I were to try and submerge the submarine right now, water would fill the entire area. So at first, just to get a proof of concept down and to start creating the game, I originally blocked off the interior up here and put the vehicle seat up here as well. However, after seeing a lot of comments and a lot of feedback and a lot of people asking for an interior, I figured since the model already had it built in, I should try and work on a feature to allow it to happen. So when thinking about this, I had three key things I could do. First, I could make my own ocean and my own water system, or I could figure out some way to use the terrain editor to replace oxygen inside of the submarine instead of the water. And finally, I could just ignore the problem. Now, each one of those comes with its own cons and its own benefits. For example, the make your own water system would work great if I got it working. It would be incredibly complex system to do. It would allow me a lot of functionality for different things. However, I do not have the skills. This is my first Roblox game, and I did not want to touch that. And I definitely did not want to just completely ignore the interior because so many people were asking for it, and it definitely is a cool part of the submarine. So what I did do is I did some research, and I used some tools out there to figure out how I could replace the water inside of this submarine with oxygen and then have that working instead so that the terrain inside wasn't actually water, it was air. So I'm going to kind of explain how I did this step by step, and we're going to go through the process, and I'm going to actually show you how to do it. So the first main thing is when we're looking at our submarine, we have to section off the areas that are going to have the oxygen. So looking at it anywhere in this main tube and this main area that the player can go in, we have to put in regions that'll tell our code how to work and where to remove the water from and replace it with oxygen. So first we had to edit the submarine model. So I'm going to bring it out of replicated storage and into the main workspace so that we can start putting in those different boxes and those areas for the replacement. So I'm going to add a folder underneath our model called water free zones. I have to add a folder, and I'm going to rename it to water free zones. And then under here are going to be all the parts that are going to be our water free zones. So the main one is just going to be along the pipe, along the hull. So it's just going to be one big rectangle cube. So we're going to have to move this part inside of the vessel. And at first I'm going to keep the transparency to 0. That way I can actually see where this is. And this looks about centered. It doesn't really matter because we're going to scale it all the way along each side. So I'm going to scale it just about till it comes out at the front. I'm going to scale it up just until it touches the top. And then I'm going to repeat that process so that it goes all the way back as well. Okay, that looks about good. My main goal is I want it to be aligned with the outside walls here. So it's not quite there yet. There we go. That side's aligned. And then that side looks aligned. Great. And then just making sure it doesn't stick out too far up here. So lowering it down. And then maybe bringing it a little bit forward. Perfect. So that's now the main area of the submarine. And that's just how we're going to get it working at first. And we're going to start on the script before we deal with any other parts of this. So I'm just going to rename this to main interior. And then we're going to start working on our script. So for this to work, it has to be done on the client side because we don't want to be removing terrain for the entire server. We just want to be removing it from the client side so that they don't see the water and they have oxygen. It doesn't need to be a server event, and I don't think it can be based on how the terrain system works. So we're going to have a local script that runs on the client side that handles all of our logic. So I'm going to go into the starter player scripts, and I'm going to add my water remover local script. I'm just going to call it water remover. Now we're going to get to work. So the first thing we really need to do is we need to be able to access our terrain, which we can get through the workspace as such. All we have to do is grab it from our workspace up here, and then we can edit it. And then another key thing that we're going to use is we're going to use replicated storage to trigger server and client events, because we're going to need to be able to communicate between the server and the client whenever the player gets onto the submarine. So we're going to use replicated storage to get this feature done. Okay, perfect. Now, what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to grab all of the children that are inside of the water-free zones folder. And with that, we're going to grab every part that's in there and use that to set up a region for our oxygen. So in order to do that, we're first going to have a submarine variable, which I'm initially going to set to null because the submarine isn't spawned in immediately when the player joins the game. And then I'm going to have a water-free zones. Again, I'm setting to null because the sub isn't there. And then I'm going to have a Boolean that will check if the sub has been spawned, and I'm going to set it to false for the first thing. And then we're going to need 3 main functions. We're going to first need a function to actually clear the water from the region. And we can name this whatever. And then this is going to take in the part that signifies what our region is. And with that, we'll be able to replace whatever part and the size that's in there. We'll replace that area. We'll change it from water to oxygen. And then the next function we're going to want to make is one to actually call this. So it's going to be, if I can spell correctly, it's going to be process clear zones. So this is going to run through all the different parts and then clear the water from each one of those. And then we are also going to need a function that checks whenever the submarine is added to our workspace. So we can do that using the child added workspace function that'll be called whenever a child is added into our workspace, and it'll return that as an object that we can then use. And then what we're going to want to check is we're going to want to check if the child, if its name is equal to submarine, then we know that that's the child we want to use for this. And we can set our submarine object variable that we set up top to be this. And then we can also set our water-free zones to be whatever folder is inside of this current submarine. What did I call it? I called it, whoops, water-free zones. Awesome. And then we can set our Boolean to true, that the sub is spawned and is ready to work. Awesome. Cool. And then what we're going to want to do is when it's first spawned in, we're going to want to process clear zones. And that way we can start clearing the regions. Now, if we go up, this is where things are going to get a little bit more complicated. So when we go to the process clear zones function, what we're going to want to do inside of here is we're going to want to find every single part that is inside of the water-free zones folder and run the clear water from region on that part. So first what we're going to do is we're going to loop through every single part that is inside of that folder. So we can do that simply by creating a little for loop and then going inside of the water-free zones variable and getting all the children. I don't know if I spelled that correctly. I did. Okay, perfect. And then once that's done, we now have our for loop, and then we can tell if the part, this is just a little check, if the part is a base part, then we know it's a part that we can clear from. And this should be automatic, but it is good to check just in case you accidentally add something else to there. And then we're going to call that function on that certain part of the loop. And then once we get up here, we're going to have to do the actual math to turn this part into a region and then replace all the material inside of that region with oxygen. So follow along with me and pause at any time. All this code is going to be down below. If you need to copy and paste it, I highly recommend you don't, so that way you actually learn. But if you need to, it is there for reference. So first, we're going to get a size variable from this region part. It's going to tell us how big we should make this thing. And then we're going to get the C frame from it, which will allow us to get different aspects, different positions, and the XYZ values of the part. And then we're going to need to know the half size for this object. So we're going to change this to just simply be size divided by 2. And then we're going to need, basically what we're doing is we're taking this part that has a position and a size, and we're creating the actual rectangular boundaries for it, because natively in Roblox, you can't just grab the corners and make your own separate part. You can't make a region from a part. So you have to do it dynamically. And so we're going to have to get the corners, all 8 corners for the sides of this region based off of this part. So we're going to create those corners using a table. And I will be copying this part as it's a little repetitive, but you're first going to get the negative value of the half size x, the negative value of the half size dot y, and then the same with the z. And this is going to be our first corner in the in all 3 are negative. And then I'm going to copy and paste this 8 times because we're going to need 8 corners. That's 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And then I forgot the commas after each one. Whoopsies. My bad. Perfect. Okay. Now what we're going to have to do is we're going to use a little bit of math, and we know that every pair is going to have to happen here. So the first 4 half sizes are going to be negative. The second 4 are going to be positive. And then we can alternate in doubles here between negative and positive, negative. And then these, we alternate every other one. And that's just a simple little trick to make sure that you have all of your variables accounted for. So we now have 8 corners, and each one, every combination is accounted for. Now we're going to have to take these corners that are in local, and we're going to have to turn them into world space corners. So we're going to create another table called world corners. And then we're going to loop through the corner table. And then based on those, we're going to transform that location in local space into a world space, so we can actually use it for our region. And then, so world corners I is going to be equal to, we'll use a C frame and then point to world space. Corner. Awesome. We're almost done with this function. We just need to do a little bit more, few things with this corner. We're first going to have to get the min and max of the XYZ variables. So this is going to be a little repetitive again. I'm going to copy and paste this line once I'm done. But in order to do that, we're first going to have to set them to some default value. So they're going to be the same at first. As you can see here, they're both set to the second value of the world corners table. And then I'm going to copy this 3 times for each variable. And I'm going to change this to y, and I'm going to change this to z. Again here, y, z, and one last time here on this side of the equation, y and z. So now that we have all world corner set, we're going to loop through, and we're going to actually find the minimum and the maximum for each. So I'm going to write our for loop to do that. We're going to loop through each corner inside of the world corners, and we're going to set the minimum between whatever the minimum is and the current. So this means that if the current corner dot x is less than the minimum x, it's going to set it to the correct, it's going to set the min to the new value that we just found. And same exact thing with the max. If the current x is greater than the max x, we will set the max to the current. Awesome. And then I'm just going to copy this 3 times to do the y and the z. Awesome. So now that we have that set up, we can go down and create our region based off of these variables. Because for our region, we're going to need 2 corners and they're going to be in the separate of each other. So if that makes any sense, I'll try and show a picture of what that looks like. But basically, we're creating the bottom left and the top right corners. That way we have the full rectangle. So I'm going to create this region, which is a region 3 in Roblox. And then that's how you interact with the world. And then we're going to set the corners to be the minimum and then of each type, and then the maximum of each type as well. Awesome. With that done, one of the things we need to do is we need to make sure that this region is expanded, is aligned with the region of our world so that the voxels actually align with each other. And to do that, all I'm going to do is I'm going to use the expand to grid and just type in 4 as the resolution because that's what our world is at. And then the last thing I have to do for this is we're going to use the terrain that we have and we're going to replace the material that's inside of the current region we're looking at. We're going to enter the resolution, which is again 4, and we're going to look for our target material, which is the material water. That's the material we want to replace. And then we're going to replace it with air. So in all theory, you could replace this with whatever you want, sand, bricks, whatever, but this is what we're wanting to do for our process here. So with that, I'm going to hit play and let's see what happens. I forgot to put the submarine back inside of replicated storage. Okay, here we go. So if we spawn in our submarine, I forgot to anchor the part. Don't forget to do that. I also forgot to set it to be transparent. So we have to anchor our main interior part. That way it doesn't get affected by physics. And then we're going to put our transparency to 1. And we're also going to turn off can collide so that we can actually go down there. And then it looks like we're getting thrown an error. Get children is not a valid member of folder. I just realized I misspelled get children. So now we should be able to run it. And then it should spawn in and we should see that the water has been removed from the edges because it's not a perfect part and it's going to show a little bit. And that's great. Now we can go inside of our submarine and this part is working. So that's a great first start of now that we have all the water replaced inside, we can go around and it's perfectly dry down here and we're not swimming around. However, this is still not fully working. If we go up and we try and move, we're going to find that we have 2 different problems. So if we move a little bit forward, first we can see that water is still in the submarine if we move at all. And then the second problem is that the water isn't replaced whenever we're gone. So I tried a few different methods of this, including having the water be fully replaced whenever we moved along, which fixed the issue down here. However, it led this trail along the entirety of the map of just removed water, and it made it look really bad, especially when we were diving and there would be no water. So in order to do this, I came up with a pretty neat solution, I think. Basically, whenever the player is driving the submarine, so they're in this seat down here, the entire sub will have water in it, but only on this one player's screen. For anyone else who's in the submarine, or as soon as the person stops driving it, both this area and the interior down there will be replaced. The water will be replaced with oxygen. And that's the system I came up with, and it actually worked really well. So let's code that first. But before we do that, I'm going to bring back the submarine into the workspace so that I can add the second region of no water. And I'm just going to copy this one here. I'm going to call this the cockpit area. And then we're going to resize it. I'm going to turn the transparency down again. I don't know quite why it decided to move so far, but I'm going to bring it down and then just center it on the cockpit area. So that's the area we want the water to be removed from. So if we bring back the scale, and basically we still want to be able to see the sub, However, we don't want these to be poking out at all. Okay, here we go. And we can kind of see where the actual proportions of the sub are based off of these models. And then we're going to just bring it down below the roof. Awesome. And then I just want to make sure that each side is properly filled as far to the edge as we can go. And that looks to be about it. Perfect. And perfect on that side too. Okay, now we just have to make sure that these two overlap so that there's no water in the center. So I'm just going to bring this down a little bit. It's okay if they overlap a little bit, no harm in that. And then I'm going to set the transparency to this to also be 0. It should be 1, sorry, my bad. And for both of these, it should be 1. That way we cannot see. And then I'm going to bring the submarine back inside of replicated storage. Now, the nice part about our code is it will already remove water from that region because of this loop here that loops through every single part inside of there. However, we need to make sure it is working and is constantly updated. Otherwise, it's not going to remove it once we dive. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a few different functions. The first one is I'm going to add the replace regions. And basically what this is going to do is this is going to solve our problem of the water just disappearing forever and still being gone once our submarine goes there. So that function will handle that. And then we're going to add another function that's going to connect to the heartbeat of our game. So this is going to run every single tick. And we'll probably have to do a little bit of optimization of this in the future because it's running every single tick right now. However, it works. And we'll definitely have to see how much performance issues there are. But right now, I'm not going to worry about it too much. And then the last function we're going to have is we're going to actually connect to an event that is inside of our remote events. So if we look inside our server script services and I have a script with all of the remote events that we need, I'm looking for one that I set up at the beginning called enter event. And basically what this does is it tracks whenever the player enters the seat and is in control of the submarine. So this is actually what triggers the UI popping up on the client side. And we're going to listen to that function, but first we have to add it up top here as our local event. So we're going to listen for the enter event from replicated storage called player enter sub event. And then down here, we're going to add a listener for that event. So we're going to have our event, and then whenever it fires on the client side, so on client event, we're going to connect the function to it. And then this function gives us a value and a name. And this value is just a Boolean of whether or not the player is inside of there. And what we're going to do is we're going to check if this value is true, then we know that the player is in control. So that means water can be everywhere in the submarine for this player's view. Because as we saw in the cockpit, you really can't see the water. It makes it look clear. You're not swimming. It's perfect. But for everyone else, they have to see air so that they're not swimming. So we're going to have another Boolean up here, and we're going to call it in control. So this is if they're going to be in control of the submarine. We're going to set it to false at the beginning, but we're going to set it to true here. And then what we're also going to do is, because now that we're in control, everywhere else on the map can be water. Everything is going to be water. So we're going to replace any of the regions that we changed during our time not in control. And then we're going to create an else. And if the value is false, then we're just going to change in control to false so that we stop filling back in those regions and we start replacing the water with oxygen. That way they can move around the sub freely. I'm sorry this is confusing. I'm going to try and explain it a little bit better once we get it working to see what it actually does. So in here, in this heartbeat function, I'm going to say if the sub is spawned in and that the player is not in control of the submarine, then we are going to clear all of the water inside of the submarine and replace it with air. So remember, again, this is just on the client side. So 2 different people can be in the submarine, and there can be 2 different instances where the player in control might think that the entire submarine has water in it, they're not necessarily going to see that, but that's what it's going to act like on their screen. However, on the other person's screen, if they're roaming down, say in the engine room, they're not going to see any water because they're not in control of the submarine and the water is being removed successfully. But they're also not going to be able to look outside because there's no windows except in control and see any of the water that may have been removed. Before we run this replace regions function, I'm going to have to add a few more variables up at the top here. So we're going to add a table called regions, and this is going to be all the regions that we replaced the water with oxygen in so that we can keep track and then replace that water back in the future. And then I'm just going to have a simple counter variable. That way I don't have to get the length every single time. And then at the end of our terrain replacement function, we're going to add this region to our list. So we're going to do regions. We're going to get the count. And then we're going to set it equal to region. And then we're going to increase the count just by 1. And what this is going to do is it's going to add it to the list so that later we know to replace it. Now, down here, all we have to do is we just have to go through each of the regions and do the opposite of what we did up here. So we're going to loop through each of the regions. And then all we're simply going to do is get the terrain again, and we're going to replace the material in the same region with our resolution 4, and we're going to switch the materials. So this is going to be material of air, and this is going to be the material of water. Perfect. Awesome. And then all we got to do from there is we got to reset our table at the end, which is really easy, and then set our count back to 0. Awesome. With that done, that should be it for this part. I'm going to show this. There will be another problem, and we're going to fix it in a little bit, but I want to show this off first. So if we spawn our submarine in, we should see everything's working great. The water is still removed. And if we go down into here, you can see that the water is completely gone. And then if we go into control, we can kind of see that that's the problem I was talking about. We can, if we go down, we can still see into the water. When the sub was being controlled in an earlier version where the water was constantly being removed, you couldn't see out at all. And you can't really tell at all right now, but we're technically inside of water. But if I go out, you can kind of see that the water has been fully removed. There's just a little bit of an issue up here where we actually have to extend the part up a little bit, just a tad, and so that the water gets fully removed. But as you can see, we can walk around the exterior, and it looks like this part over here too has to be extended up, just so that all the water is removed. But those are really simple fixes. But it's working for the most part there, at least on the script side. And then if we go back up, we can go outside, maybe, and see that for the most part, the water's been replaced. Now I'm going to add a little check eventually to make sure that once the player exits the submarine, all the water is replaced entirely. But if we go back to our starting position, you can see that the water was replaced just a little bit too much. Now the issue with that is in our script, where when we're replacing, we're not checking to make sure that we actually replaced water and we didn't just replace air. Because what's happening and what you saw there is that areas that were air are being replaced with water. So we're going to add a simple fix. And basically, whenever we create our region, if that region is below the sea level, we don't need to replace it, / we should just set it to be at sea level. So we can get the Y, and then just if the position is less than sea level, then we replace it. If it's not, then we don't have to worry about it. And then we're also going to add a little check just up here to check if the maximum Y is greater than 0, then we'll just set it to 0, because you don't need to go any higher than sea level to replace. And that's a really simple way to solve that first problem that we saw at the beginning there. Basically, like I said, all this is doing is checking that if we're above sea level, we're setting that region to sea level. And then as long as the position Y is less than 0, then we're going to add it to the region. If, for example, our submarine is out of the water like it is at the beginning, it's not going to replace that region, and it's not going to add it to our regions list. Now, the last thing I want to do is I want to go inside of here, and then we just need to change our regions a little bit just to make them a little bit better for removing water. So this can definitely go up a little bit. And now in the cockpit area, we just have to extend this up just a tiny tad. Let me make sure that that's again 0. Perfect. That should be in line. And both of these, I'm going to set their transparency back to 1. And I will put the submarine back inside of replicated storage. Awesome. Now, when we load in our submarine, everything should still be working as shown. There's no water inside of it that we can see at all. Awesome. And now, if we go into command, we can see that the water no longer spawns right there at the beginning. If we go down and then exit, we can see that our parts are working correctly and that there's no water inside of the submarine up here in the top. And let's check our interior down below. As you can see, all that water there was removed as well. And if we go outside of the submarine, we should be able to see that everything from spawn is looking great, and everything except the right here of the submarine is looking great as well. So yes, the spawn area is completely refilled. There's no extra filling above sea level, and that's how I got the submarine working. Please let me know down below if you have any questions about how this worked. Like I said, I'll be posting the code down below so that you can see it, whatever this water remove script looks like. And yeah, that's how I made this really cool feature, and I'm really glad I did because the submarine looks sick inside. The interior looks amazing. I'm really looking forward to adding some inside features so that being able to control this periscope, being able to potentially launch the missiles from inside of here, and then changing up the back as well to kind of make it your own and make it customizable, along with upgrading the engine room and things like that. I have a lot of cool ideas. Please let me know if you have any ideas down in the comments below. And again, if you have any questions. Thanks for listening. See you later. Bye.